Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So today we are going to be continuing our journey to Endgame with part 13, and we will be examining 2015's Ant-Man, which is considered the final film in Marvel Phase 2, before we go into the first film of Phase 3, which is Captain America Civil War. Now, Ant-Man had a bit of an interesting development cycle because it was originally written and was going to be directed by Edgar Wright, who really came to fame with Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz and World's End, or what's referred to as the Cordova trilogy. And he's been off and on doing some things since then. But he originally wrote this movie and pitched it, and he wanted it to be kind of a standalone. He didn't really want it to be part of the MCU. There were creative differences, and Wright stepped away from the project. Now, there's never been anything that's come out regarding that in one way or the other, but it seems kind of like he butted heads with Marvel, and they weren't going to budge on having Ant-Man be part of the MCU, so he backed out. The director that they had to come in and replace him was Peyton Reed. Who, essentially he was directing a film that was already almost pre-laid out for him by Wright. And you can tell in a lot of the writing that Edgar Wright was involved in it because of the comedy elements. And also because of that, you see that, Paul Rudd was hired to play the lead, Scott Lang. You also had Evangeline Lilly coming in to play Hope Van Dyne, or Hope Pym, who's the daughter of Hank Pym, the original Ant-Man, and Janet Van Dyne, who was the original Wasp. And she would develop in the sequel to become the Wasp as well, and we see that in the post-credit scene. But and then we also have Michael Douglas, who is again the second really high-profile actor to come in to the MCU after a few. Well, actually, I shouldn't say second. He was one of a few that have come in, and he plays an older version of Hank Pym. And then you have the villain, who, again, this is kind of the Marvel problem in a lot of ways. The villain, who is Yellow Jacket, uh, played by Corey Stoll. Character's name is Darren Cross, but he's a relatively weak villain. Corey Stoll was actually came in at the last minute to take over for another actor who was supposed to originally fill the role. Um, so there's a few things this movie does do right, and we'll go through that as we work our way through the plot. But going into the movie, we have a flashback sequence like many Marvel movies. You get to see a sequence which is actually a decent amount in the past, where we see a de-aged version of Michael Douglas. They use CGI to de-age him. And he's talking to Howard Stark and some other people at Shield, and they want to replicate his shrinking technology. And Pym says that it's too dangerous. One of the people there mentions about Pym's wife Janet, who had died, and we get clarification for that later. And he then proceeds to crack him across the nose. And storm out, saying that they will never get his technology. And we find out later on that basically Howard Stark kind of cornered Pym Industries and crippled his company, and some other things that happened along the way. But after this initial scene, we get. And the other thing about these early sections of the film is really we don't get introduced to Paul Rudd's Scott Lang character until well into the movie. Probably about I want to say roughly about 10 minutes, which is kind of interesting. Because usually you want to kind of introduce that character right away, but they kind of want to get the backstory out of the way and explain why Hank Pym is not Ant-Man anymore because of the age and because of what the suit has done to him. Um, but we go into what is essentially present day, where Pym is has now been Michael Douglas's Hank Pym has now been forced out of his company by Evangeline Lilly, who played again Hope Van Dyne, and his protege Darren Cross, who want to create suits and weaponize them. And that's the whole point of the Yellow Jacket suit, which we see early on. as the prototype, is that it is a weaponized Ant-Man suit. Essentially, it's kind of like the same idea where you have Ironmonger and Iron Man. The Iron Man suit is, it's streamlined, it's fast, it's quick, it doesn't have a whole ton of weapons, but it's still very formidable. And then you have the Ironmonger suit, which is literally designed to be a weapon. And it's basically the same thing here, where the Ant-Man suit is kind of like the Iron Man suit, and the Yellow Jacket suit is kind of like the Ironmonger suit, which I like. I think that's a good idea to start off. And again, I think the problem with the Yellow Jacket character lies more with the writing of Darren Cross as opposed to the circumstances of the film. Now, after this is when we finally get to Scott Lang. And Scott Lang in this movie is, in the comic, they do mirror the comic books a fair amount, where he's divorced, he has a daughter, he went to jail because he essentially defrauded a company, but he leaked information from a company that was stealing other people's information, and he was then sent to jail, but he's also a master cat burglar, and we find this out. But it was kind of one of those things where his life was essentially, when we meet him, his life is essentially at rock bottom. He can't hold down a job, so he can't pay his child support for his kid. His wife is dating a cop now who doesn't trust him. He is has a rocky relationship with his ex-wife, to say the least. And he basically can't. He basically is trying to work to try and see his daughter again, and he has no way out. Now, at the same time, he's being pressured by his former cellmate in prison, Louise, who was also a burglar. Was played by Michael Pena to great effect, and Michael Pena is hilarious in this movie. I will say that he does a very good job. He does a good job at the fast talking, sort of. I don't even know how to describe it. He's fast talking kind of jokester character, kind of goofy, funny, stupid. But it works really well, and he plays it well. But he's actually one of the better parts of the film in terms of just the comedic aspect and the interactions between him and Paul Rudd. Now, going through that, Louise basically has a lead on this old guy who turns out to be Michael Douglas, who apparently has this basement that has all this stuff in it that they can steal. So he basically cons uh, Scott Lang into helping him. So now we kind of move into seeing Lang do his thing, because he is a very good burglar. That's the whole point of why Michael Pena wants him to help. And we get to see him go through all these little tribulations as he's going through the building, and he winds up finding this old safe in the basement that he has to do all these things to get to. A bunch of stuff with a fingerprint pad and stuff like that. It's really interesting, the intricacies they go to show him getting by the security systems, and it's very, very interesting. So, we go down, he manages to open the safe, and he finds the suit and steals it. Now, he then brings the suit back because the alarms are going off in the house, and the only way for him to escape, he jumps in a van with Michael Pena and his two cohorts, and they drive away. Now, what we don't know at this point is that this has all been set up. Michael Douglas has set this up to try and find somebody to replace him as Ant-Man. And this basically they think that it's a just a souped up motorcycle suit at the beginning, the Paul Rudd and everybody else, and so Paul Rudd puts it on and starts messing with it and realizes very quickly that it is not just a motorcycle suit, and he accidentally shrinks himself. Um, and there's actually a really interesting series of events where we see Paul Rudd running around very small. He has no idea how the suit works, so he doesn't know how to get himself back up to being big again. And these moments are filmed very, very well. The CGI is believable. It's interesting to see Ant-Man doing, running around and doing all this stuff, because, the way that the powers work is different than what we've seen in the MCU before, where his strength is almost equivalent, and he can leap these great distances, and he can hit guys in the face and stuff, and he can send them flying because he's so small and so dense. And it's very very interesting to see him doing all these sorts of things because again, it's different than what we've seen before with a lot of other Marvel characters. And I think that's another reason why this movie worked is it wasn't just a guy getting superpowers and punching other people in the face. I mean, it boiled down to that in some extent, but it's not that as much of that. Uh, and then we get into the ant stuff a little bit later. So he winds up having the suit. He has these basically this horrible experience, and he tries to return the suit to the house, but he winds up getting arrested. And Pym winds up visiting Lang when he's in jail and smuggles the suit in to break him out. And the whole thing is that Michael Douglas is essentially impressed at this point of what Scott has been able to do, and in stealing the suit and then bringing it back, um, and even though basically Michael Douglas has been manipulating this from the beginning. Now, to give a little backstory too on what's going on, is that Michael Douglas essentially needs to steal a device from his company, which has now been wrestled out of his hands by Cross and his own daughter, who they have a rocky relationship. Um, and he needs to steal the Yellow Jacket suit, basically. But in order to get in, they need a few different things. Going back, the relationship between Evangeline Lilly's Janet Van Dyne, or Hope Van Dyne, and Michael Douglas's Hank Pym is very complicated in this movie, and it's streamlined a bit in the movie after this, where the relationship has gotten a lot better. But I do like the the father daughter relationship in this because they make it work. It doesn't feel clunky. It doesn't feel odd. It feels very organic. That they have these problems and it's understandable. And I think it's a good way to kind of wade into the world. It works again. It works very well. Um, but moving past that, basically, this is kind of your Avengers tie-in type of thing, where one of the things that they need to break into the facility is located at the Avengers headquarters in upstate New York. So Ant-Man has to basically go in, find the MacGuffin, the plot MacGuffin, in order to get into the building, um, and uh, get it out and bring it back. Now, in this instance, he fights Sam Wilson, who also known as the Falcon, who we saw in Winter Soldier, and it doesn't really. The fight between them is actually kind of interesting because it's really the only superhero fight we get for the whole movie, aside from the end fight between Yellow Jacket. We get, uh, but it's the only fight that we get to see between Ant Man and a superhero that is actually bigger than him, in terms of somebody that can't shrink, because the Yellow Jacket suit can shrink and grow just like the Ant Man suit can. So it's interesting to see that, and the fight, even though Ant Man barely pulls it out, is very very interesting, and it does set some stuff up later on for him joining in Civil War. Now, going past that, we get into what will eventually evolve into the final act. Now, the whole part of the Ant-Man training, where Scott Lang has to learn how to telepathically communicate with ants, is one of the more interesting parts of it. And I think Paul Rudd did a bit of ad-libbing in some of these scenes, and that's the reason why it works really well, is because he kind of does this thing where he's the befuddled Paul Rudd. Right? He does that very very well in a lot of comedies that he's in too. But it's an interesting kind of thing that he does, where he makes you feel frustrated watching him, and not in a bad way. Um, but if you watch the film, you'll know what I'm talking about. The but the thing is that Evangeline Lilly's character, Hope, I keep saying Janet, Hope is resentful of her father because she wants to be the one in the suit. And Michael Douglas explains that, and apparently this has never come up before, which again is a bit of a plot point, a plot hole in this film, is that Janet's mother, Hope's mother, Janet, died disabling a nuclear missile. And she was able to go past the limiter in her suit and shrink down to the quantum level in order to do it. But the problem, and this is again something that's a major plot point by the end of the film, is this whole thing of going down to quantum level, which is below microscopic, which is below the like molecules and stuff like that. You enter into a whole new little world, and the suit has a limiter so that that doesn't happen, and you don't just shrink down infinitely. That's how it works. Which again, this comes up a little bit later, but the whole thing with it is that the idea that's how she died. She tried to do that, and Michael Douglas does not want that to happen to Hope the way it happened to Janet, and so he's trying to protect her in a way. And this is a bonding moment between Hank and his daughter, and it again, it's very organic. It's done very well. Michael Douglas is a brilliant actor, and he's able to do the he plays the role very well, even though the role does require some silly things from time to time. And eventually Lily plays her part very well, very good as well. So we go past that. Again, I know I've said it a few times already, but the acting in this movie is very, very good, and it's kind of surprising to me. Again, aside from the main villain, who is a very clear drawback, he essentially just pops up in the plot every once in a while and go, "Hey, I'm the villain." He doesn't really do a whole lot until the very end of the movie. Through a series of things, we lead into the final part of the film, where it's the actual heist. And as you can probably guess, crap goes sideways. Everybody gets captured. And they find out that apparently Cross is going to be selling the Yellow Jacket suit and the Ant-Man suit to Hydra for a very large amount of money. But through a few different things, they manage to Cross manages to escape with the Yellow Jacket suit, but the showdown is negated, and Cross then proceeds to travel to Lang's daughter's house in order to eliminate her. Um, but the whole process of it is basically that Cross is trying to save himself because Lang, even though he escapes, he gets arrested. He gets arrested by his wife's new husband. Who, again, it's kind of one of those things. The family dynamic of this, I like the dynamic between Lang and his daughter. This movie does a very good job of dynamics between fathers and daughters, but not much else. Not the ex-husband, the new husband, Paxton, is he's very bland. He's very two dimensional. They do a little bit of a twist at the end with him, but you kind of think like, oh, Scott Lang, she'll realize that her husband, his ex-wife will realize that the husband's an a-hole, and she'll divorce him and go back to Scott Lang because he's a superhero now. No, that doesn't really happen. But moving forward, they have their final battle, which takes place in Scott Lang's daughter's Cassie's room, and there's a lot of really funny moments. There's a moment that's on they're miniaturized, and they're on this little train track, and the whole thing is that the one of them falls onto the train track, and there's a little remote control train that's going around, and it just shows him like cover up, and as the train's about to hit him, and you think, oh, it's going to be this thing, and like the train just hits him and falls over because it's a little plastic train, but to him it looks like a real size train, even though they're fighting on it and stuff like that, and it has a lot of those moments where it zooms back up into real world size, and then zooms back down to kind of their level and shows the brutality of the fighting. And I don't mind the fighting. The fighting at the end is actually very good, and I like the design of the Yellow Jacket suit as well. It looks good. But ultimately, the limiter on Scott Lang's suit that doesn't malfunction, but he basically has to rip it out where he overrides the regulator, and because the only way for him to stop Cross from killing his daughter is to destroy the suit, and he knows how to destroy the suit, and he's able to shrink down to microscopic size and go through the suit in order to actually hit its all the technology that's inside of it, and Cross is then shrunk down infinitely and killed. But due to the process of what Lang did, he is now shrunk down. He's in the quantum realm, which comes in a much bigger part in the second Ant-Man film. But basically, Hank Pym had told him, if you go into the quantum realm, you don't come back. And there was again, this was a small part of the movie that comes in big later. Is there these small devices that they have that they can throw, and when they hit something, they go off and they either make something grow or make something shrink. And Scott happens to have one of these things that makes things grow. So he actually hooks that into his belt, his limiter belt that he has on the suit, and he's able to grow back to regular size and come back from the quantum realm. But it essentially, it's a small part of the movie, but it comes in very, very big at the end, which is something that, there's a few other things in this movie that are kind of similar to that, the stuff with the quantum realm and some other stuff. And then they come in a large, large portion more in the second film. But now that Lang has rescued his daughter, basically, Paxton covers for him so that he is not arrested and thrown back in jail for a parole violation. And Scott is now working for Pym Industries now that it is back under Hank Pym instead of being under David Cross because he's dead. But the more important thing with the ending is that it leads into Hank Pym kind of latching onto the idea that his wife Janet might still be alive because Scott Lang was able to come back from the quantum realm. And again, that leads into the sequel. But overall, the moments in this movie are done very well. They also have a little bit of a teaser at the end where they show the Wasp suit that Michael Douglas wants to give to Evangeline Lilly, which again comes in the sequel because she is the Wasp in the sequel. But they the thing with this movie is that it gets points for the writing because the writing is actually very, very good. It's amusing, it's funny, it's lighthearted. It's definitely a big change from Avengers 2, which was snarky, but was also a lot more serious in different ways. And they actually do have a reference to Avengers 2 in this movie, just to let you know, or Avengers Age of Ultron, just to let you know that this takes place afterwards. As opposed to before, because you could muddle this in the timeline quite a bit if you if you didn't have that clarity, which I think was good of them to do, so they didn't mess it up. But the writing in the movie is very good. The acting in the film, aside from the Cross character, I think was very, very good. Again, the villain is very two-dimensional. There's an issue with that. They should have done. I think they should have given him a lot more character development in the movie. Maybe made it a little bit longer. It's not a particularly long movie. I think it only tops out. Yeah, it only. I think it tops out at around 2 hours. If you had made it like maybe 2:10, 2:15, added 10 to 15 minutes, maybe just stuff to develop the David Cross character, or maybe you had another flashback before at some point where it's Cross working with Pym, because the whole thing is that it's supposed to be David Cross was supposed to be the protege of Hank Pym. He was supposed to be the next Ant-Man, essentially. But Pym did not want him to copy the technology. He didn't want the shrinking technology to get out of hand, and he didn't trust Cross, and therefore Cross split with him. But looking into it, it was a very interesting movie because a lot of people did not have faith in this. And I can see why, given the troubled production history of it and going into the production and all the shuffling that was done with it. But ultimately, they came out with a fairly good movie. Um, Now, the other thing that I will mention that's kind of a drawback is there are a few. Again, it's more of a drawback with the characters. The family characters I don't really care much for, aside from the daughter. The daughter's relationship with Scott Lang is good. I like that. I think that's a good thing to have in the film, and it's something that you don't really see a lot in Marvel films is their relationship with their families, because most of them do not have families. They're either orphans, or their families have died long ago. The only one I can really think of is Thor, obviously, because his family is a main component of the world that he lives in, because he's essentially a prince. But aside from that, Bruce Banner, nothing's ever said about his family. Captain America's parents died in the 40s. Tony Stark's parents both died in a car crash. Natasha Romanoff doesn't really have any parents, or they don't mention anything. Hawkeye's parents are not mentioned, even though they do expand on him having a family and kids. But there's not really a lot of stuff given to actual biological family in the MCU. So this was a bit different and a bit refreshing in a lot of ways, because you actually get to see a lot of relationships. Because again, you have the relationship between Scott Lang and his daughter, and the relationship between Hank Pym and his daughter. Those are essentially the two cruxes of the film. Is Scott Lang is essentially a younger version of Hank Pym, and Hank essentially doesn't want Scott to make the same mistakes that he made in his marriage, to lead to the relationship that he now has with his daughter. Um, and also, we do get a tease at the end where Scott Lang is making out with Hope Van Dyne to set up that relationship for the future, where Scott Lang is now Ant-Man and she will be the Wasp, and they're partners in crime fighting, that sort of thing. So again, it has its drawbacks. It's not a perfect film, but it is enjoyable. It is very much enjoyable. It is more enjoyable than some of the other films that I've been listing on the Marvel films recently. So if I was to give this a rating, I would have to give it. I would have to rate it 7.5 Ant-Man freakouts.
You're cute. That was a lot scarier a second ago.
Out of 10. So thank you again for listening. Next time we will go into movie I like to refer to as Avengers 2.5 with Captain America: Civil War. Um, and that'll probably be a fairly long video, but that will be part 14 of our journey to Endgame, and we are essentially on our home stretch now. We are into phase 3, and the premiere for Endgame is 9 days away. So we will see then. So thank you again for listening. Remember, put any thoughts you have in the comments. Leave a like on the video. Hit the bell for notifications. Subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?